but it's to the point where you can have somebody who's not as good at what they do get into a position if they understand how to tell a better story about what they do.
Oh, 100%. I think some people would argue that that makes them better at what they do.
Yeah, I mean,
there's a certain level of that where it's like, listen, like, part of what you're doing here is telling stories, no matter what you're doing. It doesn't matter what you're doing, right? So the person that can tell the best story
is the person that. Well, here's another thing too. So I've been really diving into this.
Yeah.
Somebody who I keep coming back to is a guy named. All right. So what has been going on this week?
This week, the first week of February, we got the Super Bowl this week.
Yep. We have Kanye West on another tirade.
Breaking news.
Breaking news.
Kanye is all over Twitter again, or X.
Yep. This time without the fear of being removed for the things that he's saying, but that's another conversation.
It's a whole lifetime, honestly.
Yeah. So a couple of things that I've been thinking about this week are related to story.
Okay.
And it's really just where my mind is in regards to what we're doing with Constance, is telling a story, not just the impact of story, because I feel like it's gotten really superficial, but how, and I don't know, I guess like it's so obvious, so it's hard to articulate why I think it's important beyond like, okay, yeah, it's obvious, but like it's just crazy how much the story, controlling the story, affects the outcome of a situation. Like the story is almost everything, and it's so easy to overlook it, but it's to the point where you can have somebody who's not as good at what they do get into a position if they understand how to tell a better story about what they do.
Oh, 100%. I think some people would argue that that makes them better at what they do.
Yeah, there's
a certain level of that where it's like, listen, like, part of what you're doing here is telling stories, no matter what you're doing. It doesn't matter what you're doing, right? So the person that can tell the best story
is the person that. Well, here's another thing too. So I've been really diving into this.
Yeah.
Somebody who I keep coming back to is a guy named Brian MacDonald, and he's a storyteller, a writer who works. I think he's a consultant, but he has been working in Hollywood and in the entertainment business for a while, and he describes story as a tool for survival, for communicating information.
Yeah.
And so what he says is, like, he has a really clear definition on what story is. He describes story as being a series of events that leads to a conclusion. Okay. Specifically that conclusion part. He talks about how every story needs to have, he described it as an armature. So it's basically like, you know when we talked about microscripts?
Yeah.
Microscripts being just short phrases that people like to say. It's a marketing term.
That stick?
Yeah, that stick is a marketing term coined by Bill Schley. But he was saying that stories are... need to have an armature, and that armature is like the dominant selling idea. And that dominant selling idea is the number one, not number two, not number three, the number one thing that you're trying to give to somebody else, like the piece of information. And so everything hinges on that. It's the main point, and he talks about how that ends up setting up how you actually tell a story, because at the end of the day, that's what that person should arrive at that conclusion. He talks about the armature being not like a subject. It's not friendship. It's an opinion. It's more like friendships are good. Friendships are good with people that, or it might be like it's hard to develop a good friendship with somebody you meet later in life. It might not be true, but it's something that's an opinion. It's something that people can take a stance on.
Yeah, the thing you can take a stance on, I think, is super important.
Yeah.
Because it can't just be like a wishy-washy, like, oh, it's sometimes true, sometimes not. Like, I guess even that stuff, it's like an opinion.
Yeah.
But there's like a very clear like sides, I guess, to that issue.
Yeah. And I thought it was, but I thought that's interesting because it's like that's how he's looking at. Okay, if I'm trying to tell a story, I need to have these components to be able to communicate that. And then he talks about like, and it's really simple. I mean, everybody talks about story. Storytelling is what's powerful. Storytelling is how you build a brand. Storytelling is marketing. But it's really that like transformation. It goes from like you have that armature, that like opinion, that idea, that topic that you want to express, and then you test it, and then the characters are the ones that act out this thing that you're trying to communicate, and then like that conclusion leads to the story, or leads to like the person receiving the information, that you want to communicate. So I thought that was interesting. Along the same lines, he said, a drama isn't something that's like an emotional roller coaster in the sense that we see drama TV. It actually has roots in the idea of demonstrating information.
Interesting. Well, I mean, a drama at the end of the day is still a story.
Yeah,
just like a horror story. Just like a horror story is a story, right? They're warning you about something, right? There's a purpose to the story, and I think any story that would it be fair to say that a story is only valid if it has that?
The way that I would take it away, I mean,
if it has information to,
that the way that I'm interpreting what he's saying is that like it actually does like that's the qualifications of a story. Otherwise, it's just a series of events, or it's not an actual story. That's like the criteria of what makes a story.
Interesting.
And so I think that is also pretty interesting, because I think if you go back and you start looking at the successful stories versus the unsuccessful stories, then it becomes clear why one story worked and why another didn't. Is because one didn't actually hit the qualifications of what was required for it to be like an actual story worth listening to.
Yeah, I think obviously that's the contents of the story, and then just as important, right, is the frame of the story. Who's telling it? In what area are they telling it? How many people are they telling it to? Like, all that stuff is super important, and that can actually change the contents of the story. Yeah, maybe not the information you're trying to portray, but the way that you tell it, the way that you introduce characters, the way that you hit those beats. It's kind of, because it's kind of like music at the end of the day, right? Yeah. Every song is kind of trying to tell a story.
Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah.
At least the good songs. Like there should be some type of transformation through the
medium.
Through the medium. And I think, like, again, it's not true of everybody, but I think the biggest artists have a story underpinning their music.
Their life's work.
Well, like the music that they make. I think if you look at Kendrick Lamar, for instance, his songs in his albums generally are telling a story. Like he's saying, like the world is like even like To Pimp a Butterfly. It starts out where
it's built as a story.
Yeah, and he's showing how like this person was pimped out by like America,
right?
Or like the black man was pimped out by America. But you look at like Taylor Swift, she's telling stories that women resonate with, and that's why it's so impactful whenever she releases an album, because she's built this like story momentum. Yeah, that's like, she's able to.
Well, there's multiple stories there, because every one of her songs or albums telling a story, but like her career tells a story. You know what I mean? Like she's got that journey where it's like, even Kendrick, he's got a story that he's telling album to album. Yeah. It's not very, it's not the same, it's not as clear as a single album where it's like, step by step by step, but in every single one of his songs there's like a throwback or like a byline to another kind of like, almost, I think about it as like his life story.
Well, there's a passive, well, not I don't want to say passive, but there's almost like a passive life story. Yeah. Where you do things,
the underlying life story.
An underlying life story where you do things and that ends up becoming what people know you as, and like
that becomes your biography,
and that becomes your story. But then there's like the active stories that people tell day to day and through their art or through things that they're
doing.
Creative. Yeah. But yeah, man, it's like, to me, it's mind-boggling how
important story is.
Yeah, like and on top of that, so that's just like kind of casual things that you see, but then there's and the things that we're familiar with. But then you start hearing more business people being like Steve Jobs saying, the person who controls the story is the one who, I forget what the exact quote is, but he also spent a lot of time working at Pixar. Like he
one of the
essentially
greatest storytellers of all time,
right? And so he worked with that group that he saw was super talented when he left Apple for the first time.
Yeah.
And then I'm sure he learned a ton about how to communicate and how to tell a story, how to prime a story. And it's something that I think it's almost invisible. It's like water. Like one of the analogies I heard is somebody was like, stories are ubiquitous. They're in everything that we do. We talk them, we breathe them. You hear people. It's just it's the most natural form of communication.
Yeah.
And when it's one of the most natural forms of retaining information and holding information. And so if you understand how to tell a story, it's easier to communicate to somebody else.
I almost feel like maybe we learn to communicate through story, and so it would be hard. I almost feel like at this level, everything's a story. It's just on a spectrum of how good or bad it is, because I can't think of a way I would be able to convey information without telling a story. Is that possible? Even if I'm listing facts, I'm telling a story.
No, but that's the thing. Is like, I don't know if facts do tell a story.
They do.
I think they might imply a story.
No, they tell a story.
But I think it
might be a really bad story.
By this definition, I would say that it's not quite a story. It's like you might be explaining certain things, but stories lead like a series of events that lead to a conclusion. And I think it shows change. So you can structure facts in a way where it becomes a story, but I don't think just listing out facts inherently becomes a story. Does that make sense?
I think I'm trying to think of like the worst case scenario, right? Of like, if I were going to list a fact like this car is red.
Okay.
It's a really bad story because it's a one-liner.
Yeah.
But it like that's going to give somebody a type of image that conveys that the car is red.
Okay.
But it's not like a moral of the story, which is what you're kind of talking about.
Yeah, and the moral is the point. Like the moral is the point of the story.
The moral is that the car is red. So I don't know. It is a story, but it's a really bad story.
Yeah. Well, you might say like, if you wanted to turn that into a story, it might be like,
I saw the red car passing me.
Yeah.
Like that implies, okay, you're on. Like it implies so much more.
Okay, so there's this one kid and he always wanted to get a red car. He dreams about having a red car.
Sure.
And he went to the dealer or he was trying to talk to his parents about it, and they said, we don't want you to get a red car because red cars scream trouble. And he said, I'm still getting that red car. And so he got that red car. His parents let him get the red car, and then he was driving the speed limit, and then he got pulled over the minute he bought the car. And so then he vowed to never get a red car. So now there's like there's informed behavior after that. So if you're getting a red car, you might be thinking, oh shit, I might be more like in a position now, or I might be putting myself in a position where I can get pulled over for not doing anything. Right. And now that's where the story is. It's like, it tells you how to act by describing a series of events.
That's interesting. I think that's probably taking it to the most valuable a story can be.
Yeah.
But like me talking to you about like how my night at the club was last night.
That's like an anecdote.
It is an anecdote, but it's also a story.
But it's not a story.
It's not. Okay, so it would be just the definition of the story then.
Yeah.
Because to me, it's like, I'm going to tell you a story of how my night was.
Yeah.
It's like, went to the club, did this, did that.
If you're like, I went to this club and you're like, and I didn't think the club was gonna be great, but we went there and I had the time of my life. I ran into this person there. I might be informed
to go.
I might be saying like, yeah, now I should go there, and that might be implied, but that's where it becomes a story where it's like, there's.
I guess could a story be as subtext. Small as like, I had mac and cheese for lunch.
It could be. Like, if the implication, especially if it's like the implication is, and this is again me trying to figure this out and like what is my definition of story.
Yeah.
Really, we could put labels on it, but I think like the world rewards the specific in
okay.
the sense that
that's interesting,
right? And so it's like if I specify like and make a distinction, that's a story and that's not, then my criteria and standards for a story in a sense they change, and that could lead to, you know, especially if I have a good like model or a label. But what were we talking? We were saying like the dynamic or like the spectrum of anecdote
story.
and a story.
Yeah, sure. Is an anecdote a story? Can an anecdote be a story?
I think it has the means to be a story, because I think an anecdote under this definition is more of a series of events.
Gotcha.
That you're like just communicating to connect with somebody. But I think stories are more intentional.
Okay.
Yeah. That's the way that
it's got to have some kind of moral to it.
And moral not necessarily being
lesson,
a point. I think moral has like moral has like some like connotations to it, where it's like you think of a priest trying to teach you like the moral of the story, kids, is
right.
But I think if it's just like a point, like I'm trying to convey like we should do this and not that.
Yeah, that's a story.
Because we'll have more fun or whatever that might be. Then that would be a story. Just trying to communicate something that you think should be communicated.
Jake,
I got you. Nice car.
Thanks.
Yeah, he hasn't even seen.
You can have it.
He hasn't seen the whole the whole stable.
Act like Mr. Beast next time I'm here. Just like giving out cars.
And you get a car. And you get a car.
I think to really make it stick, you should come up with your own term for what your definition of a story is.
Okay. So what would your definition of a story be?
No, I think like that definition matches, but I think you need a new term to coin that definition of like a story with intention, like or even like an anecdote with intention. But there has to be like that intentional piece, which is where your bar now jumps up, right? Sure. You know what I mean? Like, and you could coin it as something that's like, you know, I
can see that. I feel like the label's already there though.
I don't think that, like, when I hear story, like a story could be anything. A story could be literally anything. It doesn't have to have that higher level of like, I need to convey a point or a moral or a lesson.
Then it's not a story.
I think it could still be a story. I think it's just a weak story. It's just a really boring story.
I think a boring story would be, or a weak story would be one that has a point but isn't told well. But I think the way that I'm looking at story now, and the way that I would, if I had to put a hard definition on it today and say this is what I'm rolling with, is it is I'm gonna go with what Brian MacDonald said, which is a series of events that leads to a conclusion. But what's interesting, right, is like if I have a story now, if I have a point that I'm trying to make, there's events that are happening all over the world.
True.
Right?
Yeah.
And sometimes people make up events too.
Of course.
And so you can shape a story by selecting certain events that have happened and then say this is the conclusion you had.
Or making up the conclusion and saying that's the conclusion, right? Yeah. So like the fake news stuff.
Yeah.
All of that is attempting to push a certain story that may not be exactly what they're saying, but they're trying to push their own kind of story.
Yes. They're trying to push their own kind of story. And then you're like, okay. And so good stories, I think, are based around facts. And a fact is something that's verifiable, right?
If that's what we're calling them nowadays. Yes.
Your facts are. Mine.
My facts are verifiable.
Right? But it's like, if a fact is something that you can verify, that's by all standards objectively true, then when you're telling stories that are not...
Here you go.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
That are not based in fact, then that's just something that I don't even think we question anymore right now.
That we don't.
We don't even question it.
It's a problem.
And another thing too is like, I think another thing about looking at a story as something that's told with intention is what is the person, especially in the media, what are they trying to get me to believe?
Yeah.
And I think when you look at a story like that, it's like, okay, are you trying to get me to be more informed, or are you trying to sway me to believe what you believe?
Right.
Because that's a different thing.
That's a very different thing.
And that's what's happening right now.
But they tell it the exact same way. They'll tell, hey, this fire burned down, and whatever it is else, they're going to tell it the exact same way with all these facts and everything to make you feel like, oh, it's from a trusted source.
Yeah.
So I can trust this information.
And they get so much trust just off of being in the printed established newspaper. There's
true.
So much trust that's established already that it's crazy the shit that they can get away with. I don't even know if they
are in on it anymore.
Are like consciously aware of it. I think it's like, I want to be a journalist. I feel like I have a moral obligation to have people see things the way that I see them because I think this one thing is wrong.
Or just because I think I'm a journalist.
Exactly.
It's like that by itself doesn't give anyone the right to say, like, yeah, I have the right opinion.
Right.
They might be more informed because it's their job to be more informed. But they should just be reporting what's happening, not necessarily telling you, hey, this is what's happening, or this is what I know is happening, or even if it's not true.
I find it funny how journalists, a lot of people do this, but specifically journalists because they're, in print.
Yeah.
When they're describing a character in a story that they're telling, and it's adjective, person.
Yeah.
And then they take a little excerpt of something that they did that clearly biases is going to bias the later information, who said this one thing to this other person that, was a terrible thing to do.
Right.
And now I'm going to tell you report the facts. It's like
that's the only thing that matters about this scenario.
Yeah.
Where it's like, wait a second, give me some context, give me some other things else that give what you're saying meaning.
Or it's completely irrelevant. And it's not, and you're like, what does that have to do with this? At all. Like, that's not even connected.
No, but they said it. And so it's like, no. You're trying
to... Don't you think you should know? Don't you think you should know about this?
Yeah.
I think we should know about that. I think it's relevant. It speaks to his character. It speaks to her character.
That's a fun one where it's like, I'm gonna chop and clip your life and then say, hey, this represents your entire character.
Right? Like, but it's but that's storytelling, and that shit is powerful.
Yeah, it's extremely powerful.
But I go back and I say, and I think
people have died because of that.
Right?
Telling a story is like that powerful.
Yeah, it really is, man. I think
it's a really fun thing that kids as young as like 3 or 4, when they just start, learning how to like tell stories, they don't realize how powerful that is.
But they love stories.
They love it, yeah.
If you tell a kid it's story time.
Honestly, every human loves a story. Every human loves a good story. That's why we all watched Star Wars. That's why we all watched, Deadpool or whatever it was. Pick the Game of Thrones, whatever it was. Like, humans just love a good story.
We like to figure out.
But I don't think you're right. The importance of a story is never stressed. It's not something that they definitely don't teach you that in high school or grade school.
Or how powerful it is.
They're not going to ever teach you that in higher education, because it's not something that, unless it's like you were to agree to tell stories.
But I don't even know if the people that are teaching us understand how powerful they are.
Yeah, I do think it's worth it to have probably an entire course or class dedicated to like either the power of storytelling or storytelling like in history.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot to learn from like some of the best stories told and like the impact that they can have and the reason why they worked.
Yeah.
So
yeah, no,
that's very interesting.
Yeah. I think it's another thing that really had me thinking about that is, again, what we're doing with our products. It's telling that story plays a role in telling a story plays a role in product.
It's part of building the product.
It's part of building the product. What is a story? I've been thinking more and more when we're building products, when we're producing software, we always have to be thinking, what story is this gonna let us tell?
It's funny because it feels like you're saying user story.
Huh? That's slightly. I mean, I think that aids and that helps in the like guiding development around the stories that we want to create, et cetera, et cetera. But I think the outside of like technical development in every business, it's if we're looking at Little Caesars or Chick-fil-A, which we just went to, the story that they want to tell is that people came to their restaurants and they had a pleasurable experience.
Yeah.
And that people leave and they say, wow, I went there and they said my pleasure. They're very in control of the story that they produce.
Right.
And that's part of that's part of the product, is how people talk about their experience with the story.
Yeah, it absolutely is. I think YouTube is probably a really good one-to-one medium for like, oh, someone's trying to tell me a story. It's like, oh, it's a video, right? Mm-hmm. And so, like, I'd be interested to see if, what you guys think the story is in this video. Drop a comment below, because I think everybody's telling their own story, and just we have to kind of wake up and kind of say, hey, this is important, and so we all have to get better at it.
What is your story?
I don't think anyone is seeing it as important, and so they're not trying to get better at it. I think that's where I know our products can certainly help.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah, that's pretty good.